fiction, but based substantially on fact. Chapter 1. London, August 1933. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. The small building at the top of the winding staircase was dark and fusty, with a pale shaft of light seeping out through the half-open doorway in front of him. He'd paused to catch his breath, and the man who'd uttered these words was so short he'd not noticed him at first. He glanced down to spot him close to his elbow, just 5 foot if he was very lucky. He was craning his neck as he looked up, large eyes twinkling in the gloom. "I beg your pardon?" Harold Dixon didn't want to sound rude, but he'd been in 2 minds about coming along to this place as it was, and the last thing he needed was this odd little man talking nonsense. "Dante. You've heard of Dante, I presume?" He didn't reply. He wondered whether he'd got the date wrong. The monthly meeting of the Bloomsbury branch of the Lunatics Association, maybe. Perhaps he ought to leave now. "Dante Alighieri, Italian poet, wrote the Divine Comedy in 1320. Heard of him?" "Who?" "Dante." Harold Dixon said he was afraid he'd not and started to enter the room, but the man clutched his sleeve tightly with one hand and grabbed his right hand with the other and shook it vigorously and introduced himself as Cedric. "In the Divine Comedy, Dante describes being at the entrance to hell, with an inscription above the gates which translates as, 'Abandon hope, all ye who enter here.' Now perhaps you understand why I greeted you with that classical reference." Harold Dixon wasn't sure he did, but nodded and tried to pull away from Cedric, who was still gripping his sleeve. "Very apposite, wouldn't you say?" "I'm not sure I understand, to be frank." "Not classically educated, are you? You sound northern to me." "The reference to abandoning hope is apposite because of where we are, the Hope Public House. Fancy that, eh?" Harold Dixon said fancy that indeed, and yes, he did now see what he meant, and it was very good to meet him, but he really didn't want to miss the start of the meeting, so if Cedric didn't mind, Harold Dixon freed himself from the little man's clutches and entered the room, which was oppressively warm and foul-smelling. The summer of 1933 was particularly unpleasant in London, and when he'd set out from Whitehall a quarter of an hour earlier, it had been a dry, if humid, early August evening. As he crossed Trafalgar Square, a light drizzle started, and by the time he'd reached the Hope in Kenton Street in Bloomsbury, the drizzle had turned into a downpour. This accounted for the atmosphere in the room, the fog hanging over it, the few people in there reeking of the unpleasant odour warm rain seems to release from clothes. Again, he wondered how wise attending a meeting like this really was. What would happen if his employers found out? The encounter with Cedric had thrown him. What if they were all such oddballs? But he was here now, and maybe it would be fine, so he selected a chair towards the back of the room and looked around at the dozen other people, all sitting apart, all men, all in their 40s or older, all looking slightly forlorn, with sallow complexions and unhappy, angry eyes, and evidently carrying the weight of the world on slumped shoulders. He hoped he didn't look like any of them. There were 48 chairs laid out for the audience, and at the front of the room was a table facing the audience, a frayed Union Jack flag draped over it. Behind it sat a tense-looking couple, both short and rotund. Behind them was a banner tacked to the wall, drooping at one end, the British Union of Fascists. Taped to the front of the table was a large card, "For Britain." The couple kept glancing at their watches and muttering to each other, and then looking up anxiously at the door. At 7 o'clock precisely, a man entered the room striding purposefully to the front. He was wearing a trilby and a raincoat, and despite the time of year wore leather gloves, which he carefully removed, one finger at a time, as he surveyed the room. Only 1 or 2 more people had joined the audience, but if he was disappointed, he didn't show it. He nodded to the couple and wished them a good evening, and Dixon heard the woman apologize to the man and suggest that if they were to perhaps wait for a few more minutes, she was sure the room would soon fill up. But the man said not to bother, and he'd start, and no thank you, there was no need for them to introduce him, and yes please, a glass of water would be very much appreciated.